Afternoon, and thank you. It's great to follow Aldo and Sandy on that topic. Let me start with a little story. So I joined HSBC from Google just over 4 years ago, and I thought this is a great opportunity. We're in 67 countries, we have 36 million customers, we have 240,000 people, we actually have more then. What I need to do is find an optimization problem, and how hard can it be to find an optimization problem in banking? And if we do it well and we take the data from one country, we'll have an advantage in another country. And just like Google's search engine is language agnostic, we will end up globalizing the banking industry. It might take me a little while, but it's there. But I was wrong. Because, in fact, how many people here think they are competent at data science? Understand how data science works, some of the methodologies, what happens? Not a lot. The issue is, it's not a data science problem. And in fact, we've talked about that a little bit before. Sandy talked about it, Nick talked about it this morning. We have two problems to make this work, and neither of them are really data science problems. And if you haven't got a data science problem, it's quite hard to get to the AI and machine learning, so I'll get to that in a second. The first problem is data. We can't get the data, in fact we couldn't get, we're getting much better now than we were, we couldn't get the data where we wanted in a way that was usable. We had rules at the time that said we couldn't use the cloud, there were rules around compliance about data being locked into particular applications. Even before the GDPR rules, we had lots of constraints on that. And so we have a lot of work on data. And then the other problem is I'd go to some of our data science people we would hire and I'd say, can you fix this? And I'm afraid what data science people, if you've got a data engineering problem, they say, oh, that's boring. Or if they're not boring, they say, oh, I don't want to fix that problem. Or even if they think they can fix it, they never quite normalize and format the data in a way that you can use it. So I've actually spent more of my time reducing data science jobs and increasing data engineering and data ingestion type roles in the side. So that's one problem that we've had to fix. And then the second piece, and again this came up, is actually the org model. And actually I loved, again, some of what Nick was saying this morning and Sandy this afternoon in terms of the roles that we have. Because even if you get that, and I think actually it was this morning and somebody said some great person does some insightful model and puts it into a PowerPoint and takes it to some form of executive committee on the expectation that something will happen if you do that. And of course, if you have an org structure and a certain model around how decisions are made and how governance happened, you get lots of pats on the back and you get, wow, that's amazing and that's insightful. But 3 months later, 6 months later, not a lot has changed. So the second piece, apart from data, has been changing the roles and the way the organisation works to get there. And we've got probably now well over a couple of thousand people doing jobs that just didn't exist in the company before we did that. And in many ways, you could take those two pieces. You could take the side of sorting out some data, our data, third-party data, and the organisational approach and model as earning the right to do data science, and with that, to take some new approaches of machine learning and then AI and other methods to do that. So what I want to do in the talk is to take a little bit about that story about where we've come from and then where I see the opportunities going forward from that. So, that Aldo was talking a little bit about this just now. Let me talk fundamentally how I think banking is changing. Banking has been about very clear process. It's the process by which you open somebody's account. It's the process by which you service the account and you let someone take out a new loan or help them reallocate their investments for their pensions and what they need to do. And in fact, when I first joined HSBC, I said, if what you want is someone to create you a great mobile app that will get you lots of stars in the app store, I'm not very interested. There are lots of people who can do that, but I don't actually think that's what this is about. What it's really about is taking banking from something that happened as quite lumpy decisions occasionally. How often do we actually in reality think about where we're going to put the money that we put for our retirement, or even apart from the obsession, and we heard from Track this morning about looking at house valuations, actually making the decision on the mortgage. These things don't happen very often. It's been a very lumpy set of decisions, and we spend a lot more time worrying about all the stuff we ought to be doing than actually doing, than we do making tactical decisions. And I'll give you the example I used to make this point internally, because I think this is changing. I think what the mobile device is doing is it's going to create the incentives for a lot more apps behavioural-based services, breaking down the decisions. And the one I used is it's very well known that banks make a lot of money from credit card debt, even from people who we say to people, please don't leave the money on your credit card. We'll give you a secured loan. It's a much better interest rate. And we will repeatedly do that because we will get in trouble from regulators for not doing that. And yet still a significant proportion of people, and quite high income people, don't do that. They leave the money on their credit card. The interesting piece is that if you are spending your money and you get the equivalent of a PayPal bill me later, but hopefully it's from HSBC, or it's from your bank rather than from somebody else, and you do that at the point of transaction, by the time you get to the end of the month and you've got your credit card statement, you haven't got this money. That decision point that banks always assume that happen, which is the critical touch point, is no longer there because all the significant money has happened at a previous moment. Or if I give you another example that I'll talk about that we're trying to do, there are lots of regulations in different countries about protecting consumers against investing, whether it's in cryptocurrencies or volatile currencies and assets they don't understand. But the opposite risk is people leaving money in a deposit account, particularly in a low interest world, which is like putting it under your mattress, and it doesn't accrue. So one of the things we look for are ways to help people save small amounts of money and potentially put that into some form of investment vehicle. Because what you find, by the way, just everything else, there are about 20% of people, and this has been consistent since I first in the 1990s was doing an Intuit joint venture, who were the people who would check their expenses. They actually would manage their portfolio. They might look at eToro, that we had the example earlier. And 80% of us don't. 80% of us, and it's not that correlated with income, basically ignore money until it hits us. And if you're a lower income, it hits you because you have a debt consolidation issue quite often because you're at that stage of your life. And if you're higher income, it's because you haven't made an investment decision. So we need to break people's money down into bite-sized chunks on the device. And actually one of the internal areas we say is, how do we take this down to decisions that you can do between train stops on your commute or you're in the buses? And how do we make that happen? And if you do that, you end up, which I think is one of the themes of today, is you end up not with one or two big picture ideas, you end up with a whole series of small interventions that we can look at. And I want to talk a little bit about what those are. So, HSBC, I said we're in 67 countries. As a retail bank, we're in 34 countries. But interestingly, we only take on big domestic banks in about 6 of those markets. So in a lot more markets that we are in as a big domestic player, we have a banking license because as HSBC we support lots of international people, but we don't take on domestic competitors. We have a challenger bank opportunity in more markets than we do as an incumbent. And the question for us has always been, we didn't want to take on domestic competitors because at what is the right point at which with digital technology, with mobile services, we can provide a better service without building out a branch network than a domestic competitor. And if you take the cliche of 10 years ago, it's got to be 10 times better, not 50% better, to get people to switch. And we can learn a lot from what other digital brands and businesses are doing. In fact, more than we can do to learn. We don't want to just copy, we want to partner. So we have lots of funds already going through Siri payments, as an example, for investors in Hong Kong. We also have suppliers that are doing that. Una May was talking this morning about Akamai, who we use for DDoS attacks to provide the service there. But we want to be able to partner with small companies and other companies to make it easier. And the challenge we have, again, come back to the org design, it's quite hard for us to partner, not for the reasons that people think, not because we're an incumbent who doesn't get it or wants to do it in-house. We find it hard to partner because we do have a bunch of rules and processes and regulators that make it harder to do that. And I'll give you one example right now that I was talking with somebody at lunchtime. PSD2, how many people have heard of PSD2? Most people here in the audience. So PSD2 is a regulation that makes banks effectively share a lot of their data with third parties. We have a whole bunch of rules about whether we can put our own data and our customers' data onto the cloud and how that's governed, and we have a whole laborious process to get there. PSD2 means that a whole bank of non-banks, as long as they are licensed, get permission to take that data, but they're not regulated by the same regulator or in the same way. So we have a regulatory arbitrage challenge that potentially you find it's non-banks that can take the data, process it in ways for customers, apply the machine learning models, and feedback services to the customer to help them. And it's just an example of where, in that case, maybe what we need to do is, again, partner with some companies that do that. Maybe actually it's in our interest to be partnering with non-banks to get the service to happen and to move forward. So as HSBC, and I'm going to come on to the use cases, in all of these, the question for us is where we can get the data right, and then how we apply the service with ourselves, but also how do we partner really smartly, whether it is with Alibaba and Tencent, or it's with Google and Apple, or with much smaller companies to start providing the services to the customers. So where are the specific opportunities? So it's fairly well known. There is a fairly clear set of opportunities for a bank as to where we should be applying different AI techniques. And at the heart of that, I think, is machine learning. I think is certainly right now the dominant force for that. So clearly, credit decision making, how we assess who we offer credit to, and avoiding both the errors of providing it to the wrong people or turning down people we should provide it to. And it was a really good example, and there'll be some of those people here. Assessing credit for small businesses that have not got a long track record is still a remarkably difficult challenge for all banks everywhere in the world. There is customer decision-making support. Helping customers make decisions, particularly around wealth decisions, is another area. Fraud detection, spotting those trends of what we need to do, and is an area that's quite sophisticated within HSBC, particularly on the corporate side, because we can link together trade finance data with customers, asset management, collecting debt, and then protecting the actual services that we offer, as the examples this morning. So let me just take through a few of those examples. This actually is one that we've done as a partnership with a company called Parity, and we had, again, even we'll give you a sense of the context. Is even this required the FCA sandbox in the UK. So what this does is it spots what you're doing, and it helps you create a saving target based on your spend and behaviour. So very simple stuff that we have. Top up your savings. When you make a payment, do we top up to the nearest £10, it's a UK example, to get you there? We found that the average income UK consumer using this was saving about £100 a month, about £60. And to put into context, if you're an average income person, that is a huge amount of saving that you can start to get, over £1,000 or $1,500 roughly a year, that you were spending less. And the basic point of the logic, the psychological point, was that, as we know from marketers and advertisers, people feel good about, you're trained to feel good about buying a piece of clothing, going out to a meal, even buying your coffee. How do we make you feel good about the ability to save the money, and then potentially you can start to put that into some sort of fund or saving tool of what we need to do. Now, the really interesting piece is there are a lot of parameters in starting to optimize this service. What time of day do I send you the message depending on the topic? Do I send a certain sound to you when I send you a push notification? What tone of voice do I send you the message? When you do the math, what you find is the number of those variables goes very, very quickly. And therefore, and come back, and I think you were mentioning Ada this morning, you can't get the amount of data you need fully to start optimizing this in a traditional way. So we have to start using some fairly smart and clever ways if we want to optimize this, so that we can learn quickly. And also, how do we learn across countries? Because we may have a lot more data in some countries, but we want to apply it into other countries. So taking this whole concept of how people and how all of us spend and save and how we feel about that is one of the areas that I'm most excited about. Let me give you some other examples of what we're doing right now. So Xiaofeng in China is something we're using for customer service. Now, this is a surprise to me, is that we've found customer service queries, and maybe it's not a surprise when you understand the data, but it wasn't what we expected. We found, and we had this example today, when you actually analyse the data, the problems that people have on customer service were incredibly similar. The expressed problem that people had was quite different on customer service. So what we found in applying, and this is language, this is where we're using some natural language processing, we're using some fairly structured taxonomies to do this, that we are able to solve a huge number of customer service queries, and this is about opening and managing a credit card, in a much easier way than we've been expecting. And I'm going to come back to an example in a second, which has been much harder than we thought, which we were there. So customer service for us is proving a very fertile and relatively straightforward way. In fact, we're not finding the need to put incredibly sophisticated models or algorithms to apply to this one yet. That's one example. Credit decisioning is an area where we have two topics coming in. So one of the areas, and we've got about, just in case, we've got about 200 machine learning models going on across the bank right now of what we do. The area in credit that's been very interesting is in collections. There are a lot of rules in collections about what you can and can't do with a customer. In most countries in the world, it's no longer legal to go around with a guy with a piece of lead piping to somebody 15 minutes after they've defaulted on a loan or a payment. But therefore predicting when somebody tells us, yes, I'm planning to repay or I will repay and it's temporary, has always been very problematic for us, because there are some people for whom that's completely true and they have a system and we want to treat them well. And there are some customers who, in that circumstances, will persistently not tell the truth. And if you're not going to tell the truth, it's actually in the customer's interest and our interest that we respond to that very quickly. And what we found is, in a very similar way, in terms of how people respond, how they fill in the forms, we can get some much more predictive views about how people who are getting into financial difficulty, once we have the first actual trigger of it, will start to do that. Interestingly, the credit decisioning upfront piece is one that we're finding harder, and it's interesting. We talked to some of the very big tech companies who are also trying to do this as non-banks, and they're also finding that side of it somewhat more challenging. So let's talk about one that's a bit harder. We have a Facebook offer bot in pilot right now in Singapore. It's going to go live. And this started with a very simple objective. This started with the objective of saying, how do I find you the right dining offer? And in Hong Kong, we're launching this with shopping as well, to find you the right type of food with an offer that will get you your food right now. And it'll be a retail offer in addition to that we're launching. What's interesting about this one is the first question about what type of food am I interested, where do I want it, when do I want it, is quite straightforward. What's interesting is the customer demand at that point then hugely fragments. So it's quite interesting. You take the customer service one, the articulated problems were quite diverse, but they generally honed in to some quite specific problems. For offers, we're finding it fragment. And this is interesting. I should have known this, because if you go back to the history of when I was at Google trying to do offers, and you look at the offer of what Groupon tried to do, and Living Social, and credit card companies, if anyone had said to many of us 15 years ago that the problem of offers on smart spending, helping people spend smarter, would still be pretty much an unsolved problem in 2018, I think you'd have had a lot of people saying, that's absurd. That's a much easier problem, much surely, than driverless cars or some of these image processing or data problems. In fact, helping us spend our money effectively is still remarkably difficult. Even an Amazon recommendation struggles, because you've bought something for a gift. What's your spend versus the spend you've bought on behalf of somebody else? Is it a household account? It's a remarkably difficult problem where people are finding improvements, but it is definitely not solved yet. And then fraud detection. We have a sealed room in Canary Wharf, where we have a place where one of the ways we've ran the data, and maybe with some of the new computing technologies we were hearing about earlier will change this, but we have a room where we're not allowed to network the data outside, even into HSBC services. and we have a whole bunch of permissions to do fraud work where we can do some data detection. And we have some extraordinary pattern matching work going on by taking data in order to identify potentially effectively networks of fraudulent data and transactions. And clearly, as a modelling area and applying new techniques, this is a very fertile area for us in terms of what we're doing. So let me just summarise at the end by saying, when I'm recruiting people in this area for HSBC, the pitch that we make is saying, if you want to go and join an online retail business or even some form of media content business, you can do that, but that's not what actually the banking industry is like. I think the next 10 years probably of applying data and technology to various industries are going to be about dealing in industry where it's inherently more complex. I mean, the three industries that often come up because they're the very big ones are financial services, healthcare, and energy. And one of the areas that we need to be aware of is clearly at the middle of this, we've got to start with customer problems. I think the big theme that we've heard all the way through today is, yes, there's some capability, there are approaches, but the interesting piece is starting with an actual problem, whether it's a problem for an individual or for an organisation, and really getting to understand that need fully. And there's all sorts of the research around having diverse sets of people who understand it and how you approach it and finding a worthwhile problem. Clearly, there is a broad approach of technology, and technology, I think, is both not just the technical technology, it's the methodologies, it's the services, the approach that go and get there. But the third thing in all these areas is risk management. So I have personally, and you may all have different views, I have a slightly different view about and we talked earlier about the human oversight, but the control mechanism I would like. Let's take an airline example. I have a slightly different risk appetite for the booking system to an airline using artificial intelligence as I do to their approach to their fly-by-wire systems in the plane. Personally, I hope they have a slightly better set of control systems and risk appetite on their control systems on the fly-by-wire than they do on the original booking system. Similarly, I'm kind of hopeful that in some of our energy systems, the control system that prevents some cyber or other form of attacking system is taken pretty seriously in terms of what people do. So I think we need to embrace the fact that we may not be able to go quite as fast and quite as far with the approaches, but we need to learn in how we assess risk management and actually embrace that that is an inherent part and build into what we do. So we've talked about security by design. And certainly in our case, we need to get a much more holistic sense of risk management by design. And that risk management isn't just technical risk management. It is the risk management that we end up being discriminatory, or we end up not providing fair value to customers in the services that we offer. But if we can find a way of combining those customer needs, the technology, the risk management, then come together with what we started with, which was the data side and the org model, we earn the right to really create some very exciting machine learning and artificial intelligence areas for what we do. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. If we can have the questions up. So you mentioned PSD2. How are banks going to take advantage of it?
So I'll talk for HSBC. It's quite simple. I think we have an American football analogy. We have an offensive and a defensive approach to that. So clearly, technically, we've got to provide access with APIs to a set of data, and actually, just as it happens internally, we've actually used that to force some of the change to some of the DevOps approach and the cloud approach. So we've actually used it just internally as a mechanism for accelerating our progress. The core of this says, if our business strategy is about being much more personal and relevant to our customers in the messaging that we give them, PSD2 is a way of doing that. It gives us access to our customers' data, potentially from other accounts, so we ought to be able to give them better advice about debt consolidation, smart spending, where to invest pensions. So we need to make sure that we put that together, and that we are seen to be by customers doing that in customers' best interests. On the defensive side, clearly, if we find customers or prospects who are suddenly giving us access to their data, they're doing that for a reason, whether it's from a bank or a non-bank, and we need to look at it. And just as one aside piece of data, we did some research about trust a year ago. I'll give you one piece of data. So we did this research. 14% of people said they would trust a robot to perform some heart surgery on them. Guess what percentage of people said they would trust a robot to open an online savings account? It was 7. Twice as many people said they'd trust a robot to do heart surgery as they would to open a savings account. So we've got to make sure we manage this whole trust issue, both for us and some of these other providers, because I don't think it's in our interest that let's put another way, it's definitely in our interest that the licensing mechanism for other PSD2 providers is a robust and secure one.
Sure. Linked to behaviour change and finance. So what have you found the most successful ways to encourage behaviour change on how people manage their personal finance?
Yeah, I think I think we're learning, but I think we've got some really good examples. So there's one very interesting piece, which is there's a well-known piece of research from other sectors, and when I was living in California at Stanford, that when they were trying to get people to behave, save energy, the data that compares you to your neighbour is much more effective than the research that says it's the right thing to do in terms of volume of people that get connected. So clearly, in finance, we would like to do that and give people a sense of, you're not paying off your credit card, but actually there are people like you who are. We need to be very careful, because there is also research that says for people who are in certain sorts of difficulties, not just financial, the concept of a group of people with the same challenge actually is not good. The research does not suggest that putting people with financial difficulties, and actually there's some very similar areas in certain areas of eating disorders, is actually effective. So we've got to find a way of taking the kind of nudge type behaviours, but doing it in a way that works. But it is working. We're finding language that is definitely creating the service. So for example, at the point at which you've bought an item of clothing, or it could just be a coffee or gone out for a meal, and we say, at this point, would you like to top up your saving? It works. The other really good example, which is pretty obvious, isn't it? If you get people to do their direct debits and their spends, and whether it's things that they've bought on hire purchase, the day after the paycheck comes in, you're going to get a much lower default rate than you do at the end of the month when people have already run out of money. So I think lots of those areas we have, and the visualization is the other obvious one. Sure. So that's people using iPads. How you visualize and what you do has a very significant effect on people's behaviors.
Thanks. And moving to corporate finance, will that be impacted by AI based on your background at GS, Goldman Sachs?
I think it will. I'm slightly disappointed it hasn't happened or isn't happening faster. So I need to be a little bit cautious. There's one area that I think is quite interesting. When I was in the media industry for a long time, and one of the things that delayed change, media used to be bought and sold, through some very fixed formats. You would have a 30-second TV spot, you have classified advertising, you have a radio ad. I mean, they were quite structured. And one of the reasons it took a long time to change was that you had media buyers and sellers. So newspapers would have their media sales team, and there'd be buyers of that in the advertising agencies, and they were all specialists in these groups. So it kind of created a lock-in in certain categories. I think we will see a similar shift. In the same way that media has now become much more fragmented, you can have an interactive display ad that turns into a video if you click something. I think we will see some quite big changes in corporate finance about the relationship between lenders and buyers, but actually, like the media industry, you've got quite a lot of processes that go on right now that mean it's going to take longer to change than perhaps many of us would have expected.
What role does regulation play into that?
It's a good question. Regulation. So, originally I was an economist, so clearly I'm a big believer that sort of, in some ways, is and I say this with HSBC particularly because we can be this challenger bank in lots of places, often regulation ends up locking in, not by design, but in reality, ways of working and processes. And I have this conversation, there are a lot of regulators who would like that to be different, they understand that, but actually finding an effective regulation that isn't tied to the current process, the worry as a regulator is you then create a free-for-all. And we're not in a sector post the financial crisis, and we're a long way from anyone being a regulator taking the risk of creating a free-for-all. So I think they are part of the problem, but I'm not saying if I was a regulator, I know exactly how I would
sort it out.
Change it.
Talking about more disruption then, traditional banks losing territory to Monzo-like banks, mobile-only banking and Revolut?
Well, it's a great question. So coming back to where I started, we need a different org design because it is crazy for us to allow a Monzo or a Revolut, and by the way, every other bank too, to create the space because we don't create this customer experience that works effectively. I would say that when I was, again, I'll come back to the media industry analogy, the experiences that were being created in the early 2000s by some of those media industry relative to what was there before were a lot more radical than most of the challenger banks that we see today. I think in many cases what people are creating is a customer experience that is simpler and easier to use than banks have traditionally done, but we ought to fix that. If you look at, and I'm pleased, it's a sort of internal piece, but now that we have got a much better mobile app and we're sort of nearly 5 stars in the UK and First Direct and in China, it makes it easier. I think we are going to see some much more radically different models coming forward. I don't think we've quite seen it yet.
More than that. And what is the biggest challenge in translating the banking experience across different countries and cultures?
It's all organisational in the sense of we've had interesting. When I joined HSBC, we had a different look and feel in countries. We had different journeys. Even mobile was there. We've done a lot of research. Creating a much more common experience has been actually easier than we thought on some of these journeys. And I'm not claiming that we've got the best design solution. There are other people there. Where I think it is a challenge is that whereas an Amazon or a Google or an Alibaba or a Tencent has these global product managers who really do have the say and they make the rules, it's a bit too easy in banking for somebody in a country to say, but that doesn't work because we've got this regulation or this market practice that's different. So the reason I say it's organisational, it's very hard to empower really strong product management teams in the way you would in many other consumer tech businesses. And that's the organisational piece we've got to fix.
Where is blockchain on all this discussion? How disruptive do you expect that to be?
So again, I'm going to, as the previous speaker said, let me talk to this more broadly in terms of distributed ledger technology rather than any particular form of Bitcoin. There are two. There's a very obvious area for us to look at. So we're the biggest trade finance bank in the world. Trade finance is very interesting because it requires, it's an obvious category for smart contracts, it's an obvious category for many parties updating, and it's a huge area about verifying the data of what's happened. So we're part of various consortium, and we're looking at trade finance as the first use case. We've been involved with conversations with people like Ripple on some of the payment side. We are looking very tentatively at some of the consumer area. I think distributed ledger is it's a technology that will come to be part of the future, but it is going to happen quite gradually. I don't think it's going to be inherently disruptive. I mean, the question is, and there are companies out there, are there people, a bit like here we've talked about machine learning or AI, are there companies that because they take the advantage of what the technology does, that they can create a service in their particular area, whether it's foreign exchange, other finance assets? But I don't see it as I don't see blockchain as the kind of the business disruption that TCP/IP was in the mid-90s.
That's difficult. Okay, very last one. Will you be able to compete with Google and Apple about experience, given all the data that they have?
I'll tell you what the risk is. I don't think Google or Apple have any intention of doing what we do. Come back to the previous question about the regulations and the rules. Their organisational model just can't cope with how banking works. The risk to a bank is we call what's called the blockbuster problem. Blockbuster, in the end, it was still very big, it was pervasive, it was the leader in its market, it just didn't make any money. And the risk, for large banks is to become, it's the cliche of becoming the utility provider of what's happened. The one thing I would say is, it's globally, if you look at the big tech companies, and in some ways the Chinese company, both Ali and Tencent in a way are certainly more encroaching into the area of what banking did than the West Coast, the Silicon Valley companies, is the more they get into it, the less they want to be responsible for large-scale customer deposits and savings. The relative return for them of the money they make versus the reputational damage of, and they will be blamed, whether it's a market shift or something else happens, and the responsibilities around managing huge customer deposits is one that I'm not yet seeing. We don't get calls of these large companies saying, we're going to eat you for lunch in that area.
Very nice. Well, thank you very much, Josh.
Thank you.